Thanks for having me out. So as Peter mentioned, I'm one of the ARARA board members, and I guess I really like a lot of pain in my life because I'm also one of the program chairs for the 2024 conference coming up in Farmington. And so before I introduce tonight's speaker, I just kind of wanted to touch base on a few notes for the conference. Most of you probably already know about it by now, but it is our 50th anniversary. It's going to be in Farmington, New Mexico. Make sure I get the dates right, May 16th through 20th. And it's in Farmington because our very first conference was in Farmington. So we're celebrating that 50 years later. And I know the conference committee, planning committee has been working really hard. I think they meet about once a week because we really want to make this a really special event. So a couple notable things that are coming up. If you're interested in presenting your research at the conference or submitting a paper to be considered, the submission system will open online, I believe December 15th. So coming up next week, you'll have about 2 months to submit an abstract, and then that system will close for submissions on February 15th. So that's coming up. And then also the last thing in this in the upcoming La Pintura article or newsletter rather, you'll see probably several things about the upcoming conference, but also in particular, I want to put a call out for, there's a section about volunteers that we're looking for. So if you're interested in helping out the conference, whether that be maybe helping with the silent auction or registration or organizing volunteers, whatever that may be, just contact Linda Olson, our president. So we can talk more about the conference after the presentation as well. So with that, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Charles Koenig. He's an assistant professor at Sul Ross State University, which is in Alpine, Texas. And I won't bury the lead. I'm also in Alpine, Texas, because Charles is my husband. So Charles is upstairs right now. I'm downstairs in our house. But Charles got his PhD at the University of Wyoming earlier this year. He has his master's degree from Texas State University in San Marcos, and he did his bachelor's degree at CU Boulder. So he's kind of been all over the place. Charles's research focuses on primarily indigenous earth oven technology. So that's a whole other aspect y'all could learn about perhaps. But he's also had a lot of rock art experience. Both Charles and I worked for Shumla for off and on for probably about 8 years or so. And so we had a lot of rock art training in Southwest Texas. And then when we both moved to Wyoming, luckily we had great mentors in Larry Lohendorf and Julie Francis. And so we got to work a lot on the plains and in the Rocky Mountains, learning a bit about that type of rock art. So that's going to be the subject of tonight's talk. I won't give you the whole written spiel because I'm sure you've read it and Charles is about to tell us. So with that, I would like to introduce Charles and take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you for Peter and Dave Kaiser for organizing all this. And I also want to give a shout out to there's many people who are attending this this talk tonight who are part of the recording team. So I just want to let thank you to those folks for all their help in making this project happen and then showing up tonight to listen to me talk about it. So the title of my talk this evening is Traditions of Power and Persistence of Place, the Rock Art at Greybull South, Wyoming. And so as Amanda said, I'm currently an assistant professor in Sul Ross State University in Texas, but I did this project when I was a graduate student at the University of Wyoming and was working for the Wyoming State Historic Preservation Office. And I actually started working there just after Mary Hopkins retired. But it was a wonderful experience to get to work in the Northern Plains and be a part of a lot of the research going on out there. So tonight, just to provide a brief outline, I'm going to give everyone a little bit of context about where the site is and some of the other archaeological area sites and record that's around northern Wyoming. I'm going to go into the pre-2017 history of the site, and I'm not going to go in very deeply, but you'll understand why I'm going to talk about that as I get into it. I'm really going to focus on the 2017 and 2023 recording, and especially the work we've done over the last 2 years to fully document the site. And we currently have a National Register nomination that's sitting with the NPS to actually get the site listed. I'm going to wrap up then talking about major themes that we see at Greybull South in terms of the different petroglyph traditions, and what are some of the many future research questions that could be looked at this site. So to give everyone a geographic, like, where are we talking about tonight? So obviously we're in Wyoming. The Bighorn Basin is in kind of north central Wyoming. It's almost entirely ringed by mountain ranges. And that star is where the Greybull South site is. And this region has been an important place to Indigenous peoples for a really long time. One of the oldest sites, if not the oldest site currently known in Wyoming, the Colby Mammoth site, is just over an hour south of Greybull, the rock art site. So a really long history of Indigenous use of the Bighorn Basin, and especially this is quite possibly no better expressed than the very large site called Medicine Lodge Creek, which is a state park. It has across this entire cliff face is covered in pictographs and petroglyphs. There's deposits there that go back almost 13,000 years, all the way to contemporary land use and ranching, but a really long history of Indigenous use in the Bighorn Basin. And of course, many tribes still call this area home today. They may have been displaced, but this is still part of their traditional and cultural homelands. And obviously the record Greybull South is reflecting this deep history, this deep Indigenous history in the Bighorn Basin. So the Greybull South site itself is this incredibly massive sandstone outcrop that's right along the Bighorn River. So the Bighorn River is just off to the left of the site over here. And this sandstone face spans over 400 meters along what is now a irrigated and farm terrace in front of the site. And this site has been known to archaeologists and Western visitors for almost probably at least a century. So these are some of the earliest photographs we have of the site. This is when it was being recorded as part of the survey and going in front of the construction of Yellowtoe Dam. That's a big reservoir on the Bighorn River, right at the boundary between Wyoming and what is now Montana. And so archaeologists came in and they were surveying up and down that river corridor to look for sites that might be impacted by the reservoir, the dam being constructed, and the reservoir filling up behind it. And the reason why these photographs are so important is because this provides us a really early record of what the site looked like before it got damaged in the 60s, which I'll show more photographs of that. So obviously lots of imagery that you're probably familiar with if you've seen things in the Northern Plains, multiple shield-bearing warrior anthropomorphic figures, lots of bear paw imagery, things, birds, other types of anthropomorphs. Here's a gendered figure. I'll show another photograph of that here in a little bit. But a lot of like really good examples of Northern Plains iconography. There was David Gebhardt, who is a rock art researcher who did work all over the US. He at least went to Greybull South, we think sometime in the 50s. We're not exactly sure when he went there, but he took this photograph that was published in his kind of museum display exhibit out of California. But the reason why this photograph is so important and all those other ones is because in 1962, this gentleman by the name of Harold McCracken, who was a self-proclaimed adventurer and the first director of the Buffalo Bill Museum in Cody. So Cody is just west across the Bighorn Basin from Greybull South. And in 1962, McCracken decided that, number one, he thought that the Greybull South site was threatened from vandalism, from possibly inundation, from folks going in and basically quarrying out sandstone out of the cliff to use for riprap along the reservoir. So he organized a project to physically remove some of the sections of panel from the site to preserve it. It was kind of a misplaced preservation technique. So these are photographs from a newspaper that went out as this project was happening. So you can see they backed a winch truck right up to the rock face. The winch truck is damaging the panel above the figures that they're trying to remove. And they're using, to do this, they were using a little bit of dynamite, lots of drilling and sawing, and just generally kind of being very destructive. So very large sections of the panels of the site were removed. They did a little bit of documentation as that removal was happening. These are what are called the Tillard Farm illustrations. These are on file at the BLM Moreland office, but there wasn't a full-scale documentation of the imagery or anything like that prior to its removal. So this is some of the best examples of the figures that were taken and what they actually look like. And so these are the top images are showing photographs from the 1950s, and then the bottom ones are showing photographs from the last couple of years, showing how much the site was damaged. And I will point out that this whole right side of this panel is actually missing. We don't actually know where that is. We don't know if this series of figures was totally destroyed when it was removed, but we don't know where those fragments might be. So this is kind of like the infamous history of the site. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but the reason I want to kind of move forward is there's some really other cool stuff to go on to talk about that. But anyways, so after the blocks are removed and before 2017, the site kind of fell into a kind of there wasn't a lot of research going on. There wasn't any type of full-scale documentation. There was monitoring done by the Worland BLM office, and especially done by Mike Bees, who has since retired. BLM and the Buffalo Bill Museum sponsored a 1996 condition assessment of some of those blocks that were removed by Claire Dean. And in 1996, they were already starting to deteriorate, and they were not in really good condition for the most part. But the site was basically monitored. One of the neat things as we started going back through a lot of the BLM records is we have photographs that Mike Bees and others took that actually would show how the site continues to erode due to some of the block removal. So you can see some drill holes going into the side of the face here. And this block, which was basically barely hanging on, fell around 2006 and is still down on the surface of the site today. Larry Lohendorf did visit the site in 1970 as part with the University of North Dakota, and Larry and his team did some sketches of some of the most prominent imagery. This is an example of one of those sketches. Again, it wasn't a full-scale documentation. It was just trying to show what are some of the most prominent figures and what is the iconography present at Greybull South. When we look at research more broadly going on in the Northern Plains, a lot of the shield-bearing warrior figures, at least 13 of these, were included in some large compilations of Northern Plains shield-bearing warrior figures. So Gebhard, Kaiser, and Poschap, and Schuster. And of course, Larry and Julie visited Greybull, and they actually collected a sample from this figure right here and did some experimental date on weathering rind organics to provide a radiocarbon date on the age of one of these figures. But at the end of the day, from this site, really there was very little published. It was never fully recorded. The primary records are on file at the Worland BLM office. And unfortunately, the most well-known aspect of the site was the fact that those blocks were removed, which was really not the necessarily most interesting thing about Greybull South. So we kind of in the last 6 years have entered into a new phase of research going on at Greybull South. And this really started with the documentation of all these different blocks. There's a very large collaboration between the University of Wyoming, the Office of Wyoming State Archaeologist, the Buffalo Bill Center, the Draper Museum, BLM. And basically, it was decided that it was time to try to do something to these blocks, get them documented, and see what could be done about like digitally preserving them at least, and putting them back, digitally refitting them into where they were removed from. And actually, we published this paper in the American Indian Rock Art volume in 2021. But this paper talks all about doing 3D modeling and how we went about digitally refitting those blocks. So I'm not really going to talk about that today. Instead, I'm going to really focus on our 2002 to 2003 recording. So this started with a pretty substantial field crew in 2002, where we focused on the BLM section. So this is going to be the eastern side of the site. And then we went back with permission from Black Dog Trust to the private landowner and finished out documentation of the west side of the site. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this, we did write a National Register nomination for this. It's currently under review for National Park Service by National Park Service. So hopefully this is actually going to be listed on this site will be listed on National Register within the next couple months. The holidays probably slowed that process down a little bit. So going to that 2022 recording. So Amanda and I were both part of the block photogrammetry And I was able to go to the site, and going to the site, we were just looking for where those blocks were removed from. But as I was walking back and forth across the site, I realized like there is so much here. There's a ton of imagery, and this would be a fantastic site to actually do a full-scale documentation. So we're very fortunate to have the support of Larry and Julie and the SHPO office in the University of Wyoming, and we raised some grant funds and set out to do this. So a big aspect of this was we wanted to obtain the internal BLM documents, because we did know that there had been 5 decades of monitoring that had gone on at the site. We didn't want to kind of redo anything that we didn't have to redo. So we just, many of you have done this at sites you've worked on. We started out, we surveyed the entire site, flagging where the different panels were, taking GPS locations, assigning new panel numbers, and then we're able to use any numbers that we assign and link those back to those monitoring descriptions that were on file with the BLM. And we completed state of Wyoming panel forms. We took lots of photographs. We did photogrammetry, and I'll show some photos why that was really important here at this site. And then we did illustrations for every single panel, and that was just part of the recording process. A lot of this happened back in the lab, as far as like processing 3D models and doing the illustrations. But the field work was certainly intensive. Our colleague Mark Willis came out and flew his drone so we could have a really nice plan map to show where all this stuff was. And a really important aspect of this was we collaborated with the Eastern Shoshone, Northern Arapaho, and Crow, and we had tribal members on site with us for the entire 22 recording, to help us record the site and learn more about the Bighorn Basin and Indigenous history. So one of the reasons why photogrammetry was so important is because a vast majority of the site is not easily accessible. Most of it is entirely over your head. And so we were constantly having to use ladders. Your neck was hurting from looking up all the time. And once again, Mark Willis, and I'm sure you've heard talks about this, Mark did almost all of the photography using a pole to get the camera up so it was perpendicular to where those panels were. And so part of the reason why all these panels were so high is because this is a very dynamic landscape. The Bighorn River, prior to dams and things, was migrating back and forth over the alluvial terraces of the Bighorn Valley. So on this side, this is the level where the rock art basically starts. And so it's about 1.5 meters from where the rock art, most of the indigenous imagery is, down to the current ground surface. And the images on the right are just showing really the dynamic landscape, and it changes. Like you can see this really large alluvial fan that's coming out of this little side canyon, how broad the Bighorn River is. This is about the time when dams were put in upstream. So it really helped to kind of calm the river and make the landscape less dynamic. But there's a lot of erosion that's going on that's basically causing these panels to be stranded. And so over this entire site, so we recorded 40 panels, spread over it's like 350, almost 400 meters. The majority of the upstream panels that are on the BLM section look like this. So again, all these are basically been stranded. Some of these are over 2 meters above our heads. So this suggests that water washed away all the dirt that folks are standing on when they produced the imagery that we see today. And this is going to come into play as we continue on with this story today. So, but this is in the upstream end, right? So from here, from panel 23 all the way to panel 1 over here, almost all of these panels are stranded. But on the far western side, the geography and the topography of the site changes dramatically, because you have this really massive like cliff fall right here. You have lots of boulders that are basically trapping sediments. And from basically once you pass panel 23 and you go on, a lot of these panels remain accessible. You can walk up to them. The imagery is directly in front of your face. So definitely there's an important aspect to the chronology of site use and how people are using the site based on when these different terrace erosional events happened and stranded some panels versus some panels were not stranded. So just across these 40 panels, what is there, right? What are some of the different imagery? As I kind of said briefly previously, there's the most common tradition is plain ceremonial. This includes a lot of outline pecked, which is a aspect if the in Kaiser's traditions, plain ceremonial includes styles like outline pecked, which are defined by Francis and Lohendorf. Basically, these figures that are just outline pecked in an outline. They're not solid pecked or anything like that, but lots of plain ceremonial imagery. So we saw the shield bearing warrior figures, some bear imagery, which I'll go into more detail with later. You also have multiple gendered anthropomorphs. So this is a large vulva. This is a phallus over here. Also, your more like not stand. This one isn't necessarily standard, but V-neck like figures. We have several V-necks at the site. Again, many things you would expect to have on a Northern Plains site. I'm going to zoom in. So this is zooming in, and this is, again, one of these areas that was damaged by the block removal. I'm going to zoom into this area. So this is about 3 meters above the current ground surface. And there's a couple things that are really important here, or interesting at least. Number one, we have the only pictograph that's present at the site. It's not in the best condition, but it was certainly a red anthropomorph when it was originally produced. But what is equally interesting is you have a lot of very finely incised or scratched figures in this immediate vicinity. And in fact, this painted figure is sandwiched between pecking and incising episodes. But you have some really interesting figures that have bison headdresses, some sort of hip tassel or adornment, also wielding a bow and arrow. But this is one of the really important things, especially coming to this site like this, where these panels are super stranded, to get up on a ladder and have that pole photography, so you actually see in detail some of these images that you wouldn't be able to see from the ground if you were just standing on the current ground surface. So the second most common tradition of the site is in toto pect. Some of you may be more familiar with this if you're on the Northern Plains, but in toto pect are anthropomorphs or zoomorphic figures that are completely pecked in, right, in toto. And it shares a lot of similarities with early hunting tradition as far as execution goes. Early hunting tradition is also can be fully pecked, as well as certain Dinwiddie figures. So not the elaborate interior line Dinwiddie figures, but a lot of the smaller Dinwiddie figures can also be solid pecked. But at Greybull South, we have a really large assemblage of these in toto peck figures. I showed you some really classic anthropomorphs and zoomorphs. These are some other anthropomorphs and zoomorphs. Some of these are really challenging to see, but just solid pecked anthropomorphs. This one has a little bit more detail, a horned headdress, and a variety of different zoomorphs. But this is the second most common tradition that we have that we documented at the site. And we do have some plains biographic. This is an image that we included in the 3D modeling and block documentation paper. So we have a rifle, and which fits perfectly with a lot of the Kaiser and Poe's chats, variation of biographic rifles. But one of the really important things that we're able to incorporate into the recording is when we did get access to the private land side, we found additional instances of biographic tradition imagery. So this is a really cool panel, very likely a coup tally count. So these are a series of rifles and spears. There's a horse, probably is a equestrian shield bearing warrior over here, but lots of rifles and spears. There's a really good chance that this is a single person's deeds that are being depicted here. So the coup tally count, and then we have another biographic imagery of some sort of surround happening around a teepee. But those the plains ceremony and toto pect are the most common. We have a little bit of plains biographic, some really good examples of those, and maybe some Dinwiddie. Again, we have none of the really elaborate fine interior line figures. We do have some very small, fully pecked anthropomorphs that have exaggerated limbs, which is one of the things that separates Dinwiddie style figures from in toto pecked figures, especially when you find them in the same panels. And I'll get into that a little bit more as we go into the end. But we also found identified some figures that so far seem to be fairly unique to Greybull South. So these are fully abraded figures. I've added the black outlines to help them look to actually see them on the screen. But these figures have been, there is some incising you can see. So the phallus of this figure is incised. This one has some incising that kind of like goes up and down the legs and into the feet. But basically, these are completely invisible unless the light is hitting these at the exact perfect time of day to really emphasize that change in topography from the rough sandstone surrounding to these really smooth areas with these anthropomorphs. And so this is Amanda pointing, and these are not close to the ground. So these are two of these these abraded figures up here. And this is a really good example that we've experienced where it certainly benefits you to return to the site. And many of you are probably familiar with this from your own work, but going to the site at different times of day, at different times of year, and always looking up in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see imagery, because just the subtle changes in lighting help to emphasize these different figures. In fact, there was some panels that were recorded in June 2022 on the BLM side that we had identified abraded figures, but when we returned to the site in May 2023, we literally could not see the abrasion because it was just the sun was just not quite at the right angle. It just had to be perfectly overhead that you get as you get closer to the summer solstice. So again, just a really interesting set of figures that are present at Greybull South. And this is another really interesting aspect of the site is incorporation and modification of natural rock features. So this is something that occurs frequently on the Northern Plains. This is certainly one of the largest examples that I've ever seen. So this is the fence line that separates a BLM on the right side and the private property section on the left side. And what I'm going to draw your attention to is not where Amanda's pointing here, but it's actually over here. And what we think, and this was first pointed out to us by Crystal Reynolds with the Northern Arapaho TIPO office, is you have these two lines that are pecked, these two curved lines that curve in. You have some other lines that are pecked down here right along this spall. And so if you trace this spall here, it kind of goes up. You have these two lines that resemble horns. You come up and you have this big hump. And what we think this is representing is a bison figure. And in fact, they're using the natural spall lines and cracks in the rock and adding in those horns to emphasize that this truly is a physical embodiment of a bison. And one of the other neat things about this is if you were to take away, if the ground surface was up here before it was eroded, this figure literally would have been standing on the ground or laying down on the ground, much more similar to a lot of the bison rocks that are found on the glacial erratics in the Northern Plains. So I think this is a really, really good and interesting example of this natural incorporation and modification of natural rock surfaces. So obviously this site has seen persistent use. We have a lot of different traditions, a lot of different figures spread over almost 400 meters. Our best guess, our best estimate, I don't want to say guess right now, is the site was the rock imagery was primarily produced in the late Holocene, roughly 1500 to 150 years ago. Some of the older figures are going to be represented by these full body shield bearing warriors. So this is going to occur before Plains folks had access to the horse and rider, or I'm sorry, to horses. And this age range is also supported by that experimental radiocarbon date on this shield bearing warrior figure that Larry and Julie were able to acquire. But we also think a fair amount of the imagery may have been produced during the post 1500. So in this kind of proto-historic period where indigenous peoples are having access to European goods and things. So based on the work of Kaiser and others, we have two examples of what we're fairly certain are metal. So this is a photograph and this is an illustration of metal arrow points. So this perpendicular bar that comes across just above the triangle of the arrow point is how the physical metal arrow points, the actual style of the hafting element. And Kaiser and other folks have documented this specific type, where this is how metal arrow points have been documented a lot of sites in the Northern Plains. So we think that this is showing protohistoric, like in that 1550 to 1700 year range. metal arrow points at this site, and of course the bow and arrow as well, indicating that that late Holocene use, and of course all the way up until probably the 1850s to 1880s, based on the biographic tradition and rifles and things. So this site was being revisited and reused over a very long time, likely by a lot of different groups. And one of the recurring themes about this and about a lot of the symbols in iconography and motifs are these traditions of power and power, individual power, spiritual power, and natural power. And obviously the motif of this that has been talked about a lot is shield-bearing warriors as reflecting an individual person on and their medicine and the power and spirituality that's represented in the heraldry and the different designs and things that you can see. And so overall at the site, these are all outline PEC shield-bearing warriors. These are all included in the Kaiser and Postchat's compendium, except actually that one isn't, but basically a lot of different variety. And these are all outline PECs. So there's 12 of these outline PEC figures. These two are on a block that's still at the Buffalo Bill Center that you can go into right now and see it on display. So we have lots of outline PEC shield-bearing warriors, many with different shield heraldry on them. But we also have several other varieties. So I showed an illustration of this one previously. These are both what are considered to be Timber Creek. Timber Creek shield-bearing warriors are often associated with Crow or Salugay people, and based on the differences in how they're executed. So outline pecked, we're not exactly sure who is producing those. Very light, could be Shoshone or other groups, but Timber Creek is fairly often associated with Crow peoples. And so you can see these are completely in size. This one has a fringe going around the shield. But one of the really also interesting things about this area of the site is the artists were using multiple different methods of manufacture. So that's incised, but then this sheep here is both pecked and abraded, especially the head is heavily abraded and the rump is heavily abraded. So two Timber Creek shield-bearing warriors. And then we have this very intriguing, figure. So this figure is a very massive. It's about 75 centimeters across. And originally in the field, we recorded this as a Timber Creek shield-bearing warrior because it is in size. This is very much an in-size large shield. But as we were doing a lot of this research, we realized that most of the known variation of Timber Creek lacks this type of shield heraldry. So you have an anthropomorphic figure. It unfortunately has a rifle shot, right, or two rifle shots right in the middle. But you have an anthropomorphic figure right in the middle of the shield, and this is flanked by two separate zoomorphic figures. This type of shield heraldry is much more commonly associated with what's called Castle Garden shield-bearing warrior, which are famous from the Castle Garden site in Wyoming for the fully abraded shields that then have imagery placed inside of that fully abraded. But often the shield heraldry for Castle Garden is very elaborate like this. And Castle Garden shields are most commonly associated with the Kiowa. So we may have at least 3 different indigenous groups depicting different types of shield-bearing warriors that are using the same space or similar space or shared space, I should say. We have 2 examples of shield-bearing warriors in the biographic tradition. This one is a pedestrian shield bearer with a small shield and a rifle going out to the left, ecstatic hair standing on end. And this one, I showed the illustration. You can hardly see the shield in this afternoon image, but you can really see the horse in here. But diversity shield-bearing warriors used probably over a long period of time. They go all the way from full body down to the single shield. And of course, so shield-bearing warriors are depicting that power, but so is this coup tally count. This is a single person's deeds and bravery and things that they accomplished in life, and putting this coup tally count is recounting that bravery and those deeds. So again, this tradition of power that we see reflected across a lot of these different panels at Greybull South. And the other one I really want to focus on is bear imagery. Bears have a deep connection to a lot of native peoples across the Northern Plains and elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere. And it's both it is spiritual, it is it is personal, it is religious, there's gendered aspects to this. But bears are a very important image that shows up across a lot of sites and within a lot of different cultures. And so based on work in a lot of other areas of the Bighorn Basin and in the Bighorn Mountains, a lot of the bears that we see are depicted like this, where you have profile bears that are depicted in profile. Some can be very large. At Greybull South, these are the only 3 full-body bears, and each one of them is roughly is about 10 or to 20 centimeters, probably, yeah, 20 centimeters at the widest. All these figures. Much more common at Greybull are bear paws, and all these paws come in a variety of different shapes, sizes, and they have a multitude of different attributes. Some have 4, some have 7 claws and toes, some have splayed claws. Some are again depicted with multiple methods of manufacture in sizing and pecking and abrasion. And you can see a lot of the different variety down here. Some also have this weird toe loop, or I'm sorry, heel loop, depicted as just a hoop line attached to the bottom. And so in this area of the site, this is going to be the upstream. This is back to where our stranded panels are. The interesting thing about the heel loop, I'm sorry, is that it strongly resembles many of the vulvas that are depicted on some of the female figures. And so once again, Crystal Reynolds pointed this connection out to us and suggested that perhaps, you know, these instances of bear imagery may have some sort of gender connection, and we could be seeing something associated with female space, and that this kind of like vulva form that's attached to a bear paw may be representing that female gender. This is a great topic for future research, but clearly getting back to the power that's inherent in this place and in these bear paws and imagery. So you know, this really shows, like, kind of just take these two things together. Greybull South was an important place in the landscape for multiple indigenous groups, including the Crow, Eastern Shoshone, and Northern Arapaho. And this site reflects traditional cultural values and spiritual beliefs. And this, obviously, the shield-bearing warriors are a really great example of this. I want to include this illustration because this illustration is showing these are 2 different fragments of blocks that we've been able to like put back together digitally and do an illustration as if they were connected, but just showing how that broke during the removal. But people return to this place over and over for specific things, and obviously the rock art is reflecting those. And the bear paws, as the thing about the number of paws at Greybull, which is so interesting, is I think there's like just over 2 dozen. I don't remember the exact number, but the only site that I've been able to identify so far, and this is just from my own research, is the only site that has more bear paws in Greybull South is the Lucerne sites in Southwest Wyoming. But the Lucerne bear paws are in trackways, and these are things that go in sequential order, and a lot of the paws are depicted almost identically. But you get to Greybull South and you have all this incredible variation that how these paws are depicted is telling some aspect of the story. And it's a really great opportunity for folks to do more detailed iconographic analysis using the Greybull South record and being able to compare it and link it to other places in the Bighorn Basin and beyond. So to kind of jump ahead to future research, you know, the focus of this recording project was really to provide a full-scale documentation. We didn't have a lot of time to do a lot of detailed research about that site, but this is the great thing about doing rock art research in general, is once you have this archival record, you can plug into that data and use it in so many different avenues in so many different ways. But some of the really important things that I'll kind of re-emphasize is there's a ton of rock art in the Bighorn Basin. And if you haven't looked at Julie and Larry's book, go pick up that book. It's an incredible summary of the huge range of variation, the geographic spread of just the imagery within a fairly small area of Wyoming. And at this moment, Greybull South contains one of the largest recorded, not the largest known. Medicine Lodge Creek, just down the bit or up the Bighorn River, has probably easily hundreds of different figures, but Greybull South has one of the largest assemblages of documented ceremonial tradition, and especially outline pecked in the Bighorn Basin. So this is going to be really useful, again, to comparing to other sites like Medicine Lodge Creek, like other sites that are known from the Bighorn Basin, and also in Toto Pecked. So in Toto Pecked, and Larry has put a lot of work into this. And Toto Pecked is a challenging stylistic and tradition to kind of analyze, because it resembles a lot of other things. And there's not necessarily a lot known about how exactly is in Toto Peck separate from small solid peck Dinwiddie figures, and what makes in Toto Peck separate from the early hunting tradition. And so we don't have any early hunting tradition at Greybull South. We don't have any of the classic Dinwiddie interior line figures. So the very large and Toto Pecked assemblage at Greybull South provides us the opportunity to really dive into a finely detailed attribute analysis of this specific style, and start to pick out what are things that make in Toto Pecked unique. What are aspects of the figures and of the zoomorphs and anthropomorphs that we can say this is how we can differentiate between in Toto and Dinwiddie, for instance, especially when you go down to the Dinwiddie sites and you have a lot of these figures that look fairly similar. So it's a really important aspect of the Bighorn Basin record, and continuing to do rock art research as we continue. So there's the in Toto Peck figure. And I wanted again to touch on this on the coup tally count. So the Oregon Archaeological Society and Jim Kaiser recorded a site called No Water, which is in the southern side of the Bighorn Basin. And there's a lot of Crow iconography and rifles and horses at No Water. And it shares some characteristics of this coup tally count, but they're still different. And this is a really great example of just the different expressions of biographic tradition, and also showing some aspects of chronology as well. We can tell that this one is fairly recent, and maybe one of the on the tail end before the indigenous people were completely displaced from the Bighorn Basin. This may be one of these, just a more recent example of this biographic tradition in the Bighorn Basin compared to No Water. And so going off of that, the big questions, right, are how does Greybull South fit into a regional context regarding the various motifs, traditions, and iconography? The easiest one to look at with this are the shield-bearing warriors, and the Kaiser and Potzchak compendium of all of the shield-bearing warriors is a fantastic place to start. But it's really important then to take a more localized approach. How do these figures at Greybull compare to other documented figures in the Bighorn Basin? And as there's more work hopefully happening at Medicine Lodge Creek, this is going to be a really great area to compare and try to especially start to sort out, is this figure potentially Castle Gardens? And if it is Castle Gardens, it really shows it increases the range of variation that we think of what should be a Castle Garden shield. And of course, the bear paws, which I've already touched on, coming from Shumla, and that's what one of the things Amanda and I did was just look at the different attributes of all these figures and break it down in the smallest pieces. And I mean, we've done this. This is probably a high. This is overemphasizing this fact. But when you're on the site, you look at these and you think, wow, there's none of these that are the same. And if there's none of those that are the same, then that means that there's a reason why none of them are the same. And to continue to research that point. These abraded figures. Right now, these are the only abraded figures that we know of that have been recorded in the Bighorn Basin. Undoubtedly, this is not fact, right? I'm sure there's more of these types of figures that are many sites in Wyoming and Montana and other places. But what this shows is that, again, when you get to these sites, you're not just looking for pecking and very prominent images, and even you're not even just looking for the faintly incised or lightly scratched figures. You also have to expand what your brain is looking for to look for things like these abraded figures, and especially when they're so incredibly difficult to see. But right now, we don't know anything about this. We don't know anything about the geographic extent of these figures. We don't know anything about the iconography or the attributes. So we really need to find more of these figures at different sites and start to relate them to styles like outline pecked or ceremonial tradition more broadly, and see how do these abraded figures fit into this. And continuing along, like the going from bigger picture stuff, focusing still on Greybull South, one of the big questions, I think, is can the differential use of space or inter-site distribution of rock art traditions at the site be linked to different cultural ethnic groups? I talked about the fact that you have a lot of stranding, panel stranding that's happening. So in this photograph, all this stuff was, there was a terrace that was up here at one point, and the Bighorn River came and washed all that sediment out and stranded those panels. But the reason this is important for understanding differential use of space is because the majority of the outline pecked imagery at the site is found in this upstream area. In the downstream area, this is where all of the biographic tradition stuff is. Most of the Intoto Pect is down in the downstream end, as well as all the Timber Creek shield-bearing warriors. So you do have this separation of these different traditions. And the question is this just due to geology, right? Is it just due to that panel stranding? Or are we looking at an expression of culture, an expression of respecting space and differential use of space? And this is something that I think future research can really start to look at the iconography and motifs present and start to try to evaluate this question. And just like so many sites, and this is a common question in a lot of different rock art projects, is trying to provide some more control on the chronology. I think there's a potential that we could actually do some direct dating here. There may be organics preserved in this single red pictograph, but there's also alternative methods. There's been a lot of work that's been done in including just at Legend Rock in the the southern Bighorn Basin, using portable X-ray fluorescence to measure the changes in the ratio of manganese and iron, as measured on a petroglyph versus unmeasured on a piece of graffiti that has a known date of production. And you can create a regression line to give you a relative age of something, but just a way to provide more of a chronology of site use, and as well as evaluating the deposits. There's a massive erosional gully that cuts directly in front of the site, and you have 2 to 3 meters of stratified fill. We have no idea if this fill is just in the last 200 years. We don't know if it's 1,000 years old. We suspect that it probably is roughly that erosional event again happened between 16 and 1700. So we could be looking at just 200 to 300 years of deposition, but we don't know. And this would be a really great opportunity for someone to come in and test these terrace deposits to try to find some evidence linking the dirt archaeological record to the iconography and symbolism we see on the cliff wall. So to wrap it all up, I'll try to finish before an hour. Greybull South reflects the traditional cultural values and spiritual beliefs of Indigenous peoples who lived in the Bighorn Basin during the late Holocene. Continued research of Greybull iconography will undoubtedly yield additional information about Indigenous lifeways and how Greybull South functioned within the larger context of Indigenous cultures in the Bighorn Basin and Wyoming. And I just want to end with a giant thank you and shout out to so many people that helped make this project happen. Obviously, the recording team, the landowners, the land managers, the folks who helped with the digitization project, and our grant funders, and especially with the Wyoming SHPO office for kind of being the push to make this project really happen. So thank you all very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Charles. And at this point, if anybody does have some questions or comments, please use the chat, and then we'll relay that to the speaker. I don't believe we have anything yet, so other than some compliments. So maybe some will come in shortly. I did have a question for you, just in terms of the fact that, you know, you've got different heights, presumably relating to different periods of time. What's the time range that you are expecting, you know, on this rock art?
So yeah, I think it's going to be about 1500 to roughly 150 years ago. We don't have any Dinwiddie imagery that's going to say that this could be potentially 6,000 or 7,000 years old, and we also don't have any of the early hunting tradition, which is also potentially early Holocene or even late Pleistocene. So we lack those earlier styles. And the oldest uh, iconographic attribute that we have is really those full-bodied shields. And so based on the work of, again, Larry and Julie and Dave Kaiser and a lot of other folks, that you're probably looking at around 1,500 years ago is when that type of iconography started.
Okay, because there still seem to be a lot of cliff face above where you recorded stuff. Have you checked it out pretty thoroughly to know that there's nothing farther up?
Oh, so okay. We definitely spent a lot of time looking high up, and that's one thing we from our work at a lot of different sites in Texas and throughout the plains is you want to look here and maybe you look up here, but you got to crane your neck back and you have to look all the way up. And there is certainly imagery that goes up, especially in the area that has been undercut and those panels have been stranded. You have imagery there that is 6 meters above the current ground surface, which is an additional 3 meters above the stranding. So you definitely you have some higher imagery. And one of the big challenges, there's always challenge. Geology is an incredibly complicating factor when you're using terrace erosion and formation to try to provide a relative date on the imagery, because you don't always have you don't always have a successive record of like erosion and deposition like this. It can be kind of catastrophic events. That basically what I'm trying to say is that surface could have been stable, that folks are standing on to produce the rock art in that upstream area. That surface could have been stable for millennia. That would have allowed access to just that wedge, and so we could have older imagery that is still at the same level. I'm not sure if I'm making it doesn't have to be higher up.
Okay, so we have some other questions coming in. Let me take a quick look here. Okay, question on the Entoto Peck style. And how is that special from all the hundreds of full-bodied Peck panels throughout the Southwest?
I mean, that is a fantastic question, and the reality is that there needs to be a lot more research done to kind of look at the differences between these. And Larry and Julie have certainly spilt the most ink on this topic, especially, and they draw relationships to fully pecked styles of rock imagery that are further in the Southwest. Yeah, as I kind of said, it's going to be a great topic for future research. Yeah, I'll leave it at that because I'm getting out of my depth to really talk about any more specifics.
Another question. We've always seen lots of bear paws. Have there been any bear remains found at this area?
I'm actually not. I'm not. I do not know. To venture a guess, my instinct would say there have been at least probably fragmentary remains found at various different rock shelters and excavations, but I'm not sure. Certainly, there were both black bears and grizzly bears in that part of the world up until Euro-Americans emigrated.
Another question. Any guesses why you're not seeing much Dinwiddie at this site?
That's another really great question. I'll lean heavily on once again Larry and Julie for this in their book in the idea that the river itself was some sort of barrier or boundary. And I'm not trying to say a boundary that people and ideas didn't cross that, but that there's some relationship between the west side of the Bighorn River and the east side of the Bighorn River, and the imagery that you might see on either side is going to be different. So it's not that the people didn't cross the river, it's something, and the ideas that the people had didn't cross the river, but it's probably something related to the meaning associated with those images are more powerful on one side or in one location than another location.
Okay, a couple of comments and questions about the chronology. So one comment was that the historic graffiti could provide important chronological information. It says, if I recall correctly, most of the names and dates were below the undercut, except on the downstream end where the panels are accessible from the rockfall. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is absolutely correct. Most of the on the BLM section where you do have that undercutting, almost all the graffiti is low. And once you get onto the area where it's still accessible, you clearly had some folks that I don't know, we're not sure if they were rappelling or what they were doing. You have like the very carefully chiseled names and dates of like the 1930s that and most often I've seen those associated with like railroad surveyors. But they were clearly getting, we're talking 3 to 4 meters above the ground surface on the downstream end to chisel their names in. But yes, the lack of graffiti on the indigenous imagery in the upstream end suggests that the erosion certainly happened before Euro-Americans entered the Bighorn Basin.
And then another way to look at it, someone recommends bringing in a geomorphologist. Could you bring a geomorphologist in to identify date ranges for the depositions below?
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the best examples of this, the Wold Rock Art District, which is a series of sites on the east side of the Bighorn Mountains that Amanda did a National Register nomination for, and also published with collaborations with Julie and Larry and Aaron Bryn in American Indian Rock Art. And Julie, so I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. What they did as part of the Wold Rock Art District project is they were looking at the erosional and depositional sequences of the Casey Terrace, which is a depositional unit that covers a lot of areas in the Powder River Basin. And they brought out geomorphologists to provide OSL ages on when certain units of that terrace were deposited, and also worked in radiocarbon dates and other archaeological work that had been done prior to the Wold District recording. So the short answer to your question is yes. Having a geomorphologist look at the site formation process, especially in the alluvial terrace in front of the site, can be incredibly informative to help constrain some of the ages of when the certain panels were accessible.
Speaking about accessible, someone asks whether this site will be made accessible to public viewing similar to Legend Rock or Medicine Lodge.
The BLM Worland office right now is trying to work up a plan work up an access plan. I'll say it like that. Obviously, part of the site is on private property, and they want to be sure that the private landowner is comfortable with everything that's going on. And whether the site is going to be developed or not, I'm not sure. I think this is a long-term project that's coming down and it's going to be in collaboration with Worland BLM and also the Buffalo Bill Center in Cody. The new curator, one of the new curators of archaeology there, wants to kind of create, bring the history, not just the indigenous history of Greybull South, but also the archaeological history as far as the block removal and all that stuff. So the BLM and the Buffalo Bill Center are going to be working together to come up with a way to make the site accessible and tell the story. I don't know, I have no idea what a timeline for that will be, because right now it is obviously you can go to it if you know where it is, but they're certainly not trying to advertise its location, because it's not in it needs a little bit more development to make it safe for everyone to go.
Okay, another comment is regarding a rock art panel in Salt Creek Canyonlands National Park, Utah, called All American Man. That is very similar to one of the shield men that had the feet facing to the right. You probably know which one we're talking about. Have you seen the painted rock art image named All American Man?
I saw it. I say I saw it. I think I saw it when I was like 7 or 8. And this is the one you're talking about. I think you're talking about the one with the lines in the lower portion of the shield, I believe.
Yeah, I think
But
it kind of looks like a flag or something, if I'm remembering correctly.
yeah.
Yeah, how do you think those relate?
I mean, that's a really great question, and that's one of the really interesting things about the shield-bearing warrior figures is that you're looking at a specific person, or at least a specific set of medicine, and the power that is imbued into that shield by the heraldry that's depicted. So even if there's a lot of research that can be done to look at these like really broad geographic connections to that iconography. So, but that's, yeah.
Another question in terms of relationships. Someone is asking about a relationship with the bear imagery at the wold on the other side of the bighorns.
Um, so this is one of it's in the Wold Rock Art District. A lot of the bears are full body bears, and some are very large. Some of the bears, one of the bears is like a meter, almost a meter, from nose to where it kind of erodes on the rear end. And this is something that would be a fantastic research question to explore is really why are there full body bears represented on the east side of the Bighorn Mountains in the Wold District versus a lot of bear paws? And talking with Indigenous folks and doing a lot of ethnographic research to try to pull that apart, I think would be a really interesting question to ask. Also, the methods of manufacture. A lot of the bears in the Wold District are painted. And whereas all the ones at Greybull are all pecked and incised and abraded.
Yeah, somebody mentions that there are still bears in the area, in the bighorns. So I guess, again, a lot of thank yous showing up in the chat. And we can kind of draw it to a close here. But you mentioned a lot of future work. Do you have anything in particular that you do expect to be attacking next on this particular area, or you pretty much moved on to elsewhere?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think no, I'm never going to say never about doing more research. And I think this is the beauty of being in a collaborative relationship with so many wonderful researchers and colleagues is that there's always a potential to pull in a different site and be able to compare a site that no one has yet like kind of recorded and put into publication with Greybull. So right, I guess really to answer your question very, very concisely, at the moment, I don't have any plans for Greybull, but certainly I would love to continue researching the sites and putting it into a bigger context.
Well, great. Thanks a lot for sharing that with us. And again, thanks to all the attendees for your interest and your questions. And if we have some new people that would like to learn more about ARARA or get involved, please check out our website, our Facebook pages, and our YouTube channel. We invite you all, of course, to renew or join our membership, support the study and conservation of rock art. And we look forward to seeing you in 2024. So until then, y'all stay safe. Good night.